What a word, right? Ephemeral. I literally had to look this up in the dictionary. Ephemeral, for the most part, means temporary. Now, if you go through the Amazon documentation, you might find another name for ephemeral storage, which is instance store or instance store volumes. So again, these are another name for ephemeral, which is again temporary storage. Now, it's also temporary block level storage, which means the difference between ephemeral and some of the other storage types that we're going to talk about is an ephemeral volume is connected to an EC2 instance, and the storage is located on the same server that is hosting that EC2 instance. So for those of you that come from the virtualization world, for instance, if you have an ESXi host or if you have a Hyper-V host that has local storage and you spin up a VM and you provision that VM with local block level storage on that local server, that would be the equivalent of ephemeral storage in this case. So it's temporary block level storage which is hosted on the same server that's presenting the EC2 instance. It's free storage with an EC2 instance. That's very important. So ephemeral storage is probably the only type of storage that you get from AWS which is completely free, which is what makes it interesting and appealing, and we'll talk about some use cases and scenarios in a second. The data, however, is lost when the instance is terminated or stopped. Now, there's a lot of confusion when it comes to this particular statement because some people think that, what do you mean by stopped, Eli? So does that mean that when I restart my EC2 instance, my data is going to be lost as well? No. If you reboot the instance, then your data is going to persist. However, if you terminate that instance or if you stop that instance completely, then the data will be lost from an ephemeral storage volume or an instance store volume. So that's the difference here for you to make that determining factor. Now, if you had an EBS, for example, volume that was attached and you delete or you stop the instance, then that data would persist. You can even delete the EC2 instance and the EBS volume would persist. The difference here is that with an ephemeral volume or with ephemeral storage, that volume per se is attached to the EC2 instance. There's no way to detach that ephemeral volume from the EC2 instance. They come in one package. It's take it all, right? It's take it or leave it. There's no SLA, no service level agreement for an ephemeral storage, and the access speed is also not guaranteed. So it's all going to depend on how many other users are on that particular server and how much they're hammering the storage. So that will be the determining factor of the access speed for this type of storage. It's ideal for temporary storage, right? Things for information that's constantly changing. So for instance, like buffers or caches or scratch data. All of that temporary memory type storage level things, these would be ideal for. They're also ideal, for instance, if you have a fleet of web servers. So let's say maybe you have 10 or 20 or 100 web servers where the data for these web servers is being replicated or load balanced and replicated, then you really don't care at that point if a particular instance fails, because as soon as you bring up another instance, well, that data is being replicated, right? So in this case, if you're using ephemeral storage, well, guess what? First of all, you're gaining the free storage because you're not being charged. You don't really care about the fact that data is lost if you happen to stop a particular instance or terminate it, because as soon as you bring in another instance into the pool, it's going to start replicating the data to it. So again, you see here, these are small particular examples of how to use it. I'm sure you're thinking about development and test and a whole slew of other things where you can use this non-persistent data per se. It's not non-persistent completely, but to a certain extent, it's non-persistent because some of us are going to be worried, well, what if I stop completely the EC2 instance because I'm trying to save on usage charges? Well, this wouldn't be the type of storage that you would want to have that AMI provisioned with. So again, depending on the use case would dictate whether or not you're using ephemeral storage. Now, there are AMIs that when you're going through the selection, AMIs and Amazon machine image, there are AMIs that come with ephemeral storage. So you'll have to find the ones that come with ephemeral storage, otherwise they come with EBS. So you'll have to look for those if you're trying to provision them for a particular use case. Again, web servers and other types of load balanced pooled servers that have replication by default could take advantage of ephemeral storage. Amazon Simple Storage Service, S3. Have you figured it out yet why it's called S3? Again, Amazon Simple Storage Service. 3 S's, S3. Kind of cool. So S3 is the first AWS service that was introduced in 2006. Now remember, AWS has been around before 2006, but it was in 2006 when officially S3 was the first AWS service. So it's been around for a while. It's also internet accessible storage via HTTP and HTTPS. Now you're probably wondering, why would Amazon start with a storage service? Now we're going to talk a lot about S3. S3 is essentially the foundation, in my opinion, of AWS just because of its depth and breadth and its capabilities. And I'm going to give you a real world example of something that happened to me actually with my brother and how S3 kind of solved this. But let me go through this real quick. So it's internet accessible storage. Whatever you place into the S3 bucket. So again, S3 has the concept of a bucket. You can think of a bucket as a drive, for instance, where you can create folders and directories and you can place files in there. So that concept of a bucket, it's internet accessible, which means you can reach your files using HTTP and HTTPS. You can store things like audio, video, images. You can store your backups in there. So it's very helpful and it's very easy. It's an unlimited bucket size. There's no limit on how much you can put in the bucket, but there's a limit on how much the object, the single object size can be. So you can only have an audio file, for instance, that's up to 5 terabyte in size. You can have a video file that's only up to 5 terabyte in size, but you can drop multiples of these files within this bucket, of course. Now it's priced on storage used. So however much you occupy from an S3 buckets perspective or a capacity perspective, you pay for that. You don't pay for anything, any bandwidth for importing your data into an S3 bucket. You do pay if you're transferring data out of your S3 bucket. Now the other thing is it's not a file system. Now when I say that, those of you that know that Dropbox, for example, is running completely on Amazon S3 for that matter, are probably wondering, well, wait a minute, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose? Isn't Dropbox technically giving me a file system of sort? Or am I not using Dropbox like a file system? I create directories on there, I put files up there, etc., etc. Well, the answer is yes. Now, what is the contract? How is Amazon structuring this with Dropbox in the background to allow for this to happen is a different matter completely. But from a use case perspective, Amazon doesn't want you to map a drive, for example, and use S3 as a map drive. You might have some challenges if you even do that. So the idea here isn't to treat it as a file system. It's not to be able to substitute that for a map drive. If you're going to do that, then go with a service like Dropbox that has that particular functionality built in. Now, what's a good use for S3 and how could you use it in the real world? And let me give you a perfect example of this. My brother came to me and said, you know what, I'm starting a new business. It's a web-based business and I want to be able to do drop shipping. Now, he's contacted certain companies, he's gotten catalogs from these companies, and he's figured everything out, right? So he wants to sell on Amazon, actually, for that matter. He's selling on the Amazon e-commerce side of it. But he's challenged with a problem in that he doesn't know what to do with the amount of pictures for the products that he wants to sell. And I'm talking about thousands and thousands of pictures. Now, without S3, you would have to kind of go to a hosting provider and host a server or a virtual server and then drop these, on IIS or Apache and make that particular directory available and hope that Amazon will accept this type of a connection because Amazon wants it to be accessible via HTTP and HTTPS. For instance, they won't accept that you put it on Dropbox and it's a challenge to share each and every one of those files and there's just way too many of them. So, well, what do? Well, you can drop all of these thousands and thousands of files in an S3 bucket because it's internet accessible storage, so you can access it via HTTP and HTTPS. For him, it solves the problem almost immediately. He drops those files there. It's internet accessible. He puts it in a spreadsheet, each file, and the relevant image to it, uploads it to the Amazon e-store that he has, and bada bing, bada boom, he is up and running in a matter of minutes. Now that's an ideal use case, for example, for S3. You could also turn S3 into a website, or you can host your website on S3. Now there are caveats. If it's a static website, right? So you don't have a lot of scripts that need to run. It's not going to have any of those engines that make the website dynamic. But if you have a bunch of HTML files that are pointing to images and text, then you absolutely can host your website on S3. I'll show you during the demo purposes kind of how you do that. But as soon as you create a bucket, that bucket essentially becomes a fully qualified domain name that you can access from the internet. So for example, if your S3 bucket was, for all intents and purposes, a plural site, for instance, it would be pluralsite.amazon.com, and you'd be able to access it that way. And if you have an index or a default HTML or ASP or ASPX, whatever it is, files up there, then it would load them. So it's essentially a web service as well, where you can host your website on there if it has static content. Now, as far as S3 is concerned, S3 has 99.99% service level agreements, which means it's going to be up 99.99% of the time. Again, remember, S3 is a very popular service. It's one of the flagship offerings that AWS has. So from an SLA perspective, you can almost, bet the bank or bet the house that they're going to be paying attention on this particular service. Now, one thing that I want to make clear is SLA is going to be very different than data durability, which we're going to talk about in a second. But from an uptime perspective, it's important to understand and important to know that they are providing a 99.99% SLA for this. Now, there are two types of S3 storage. There is the standard S3 storage, and I know this is kind of a ridiculous number, but it's true. This is a 99 point, I don't know how many 9% durability as far as the data is concerned, which means if you store, and this, what I'm about to tell you, comes directly off of the Amazon documentation. If you store 10,000 objects in an S3 bucket, the amount of loss of data would be 1 every 10 million years. No joke. This is not a joke. It would be 1 every 10 million years. Now you're probably asking, well, how do they achieve this level of data durability? What they're doing is they are replicating your data every time you store anything in that bucket. It's getting replicated at least 3 times on multiple devices within the same availability zone and within multiple availability zones within the same region. So if you have a region that has 3 availability zones, then that particular file is being replicated several times within the same availability zone and then within the different availability zones that make up that region. S3, if you read the documentation, they can sustain up to 2 availability zone failures and keep your data protected. So it's extremely high durability uptime when it comes to that. Now, from a pricing perspective, I've put up some pricing here, but I'm going to show you a little bit later on the website that you can visit in order to check the pricing. But for the first terabyte that you upload to your S3 bucket, this is the price that you pay per gigabyte. It's something to the 0.03, 3 pennies or 3 cents or whatever that calculation comes to. So that's with standard storage. Now, you also have something called reduced redundancy storage, or RRS. So with RRS, your first terabyte, it's a little cheaper, and you also get reduced reliability, right? So now you're getting 99.99%. So for example, you might have, for every 10,000 objects that you put in S3, you'll have 1 per year that will fail. Now, for that 1 that will fail, you can also set up notifications so that you are getting notified that, hey, this particular object has failed or is inaccessible, etc. So you have this type of stuff. But again, it's still being replicated. It's just a different type of durability, and that's why the price is cheap. Now you're probably asking, well, why would I use this? What's a good example, for example, to use this? If you are uploading your photos, for instance, and these photos, maybe you are a photographer or maybe you are a web designer, and there are some high resolution photos and there are some low resolution photos, and maybe there are some thumbnails. What you can do is you can put your high resolution photographs on the standard storage, and then you can put your lower resolution photographs or the thumbnails on reduced storage. They're still going to consume space, so why not put them on cheaper space? That way you can save some money. Now think of this again for a company like Pluralsight that maybe has tons and tons of videos. Maybe we're putting the master on standard storage, and then if we have different formats for the iPhone or for the iPad or for an Android device that maybe has a reduced quality, the size might be different, whatever the the idea might be here, you could put that on reduced redundancy storage, or the RRS, because you have the master kind of in a reliable standard storage with all that durability, but all these different variations of that master can be stored elsewhere. Now, the beauty of this is that you have granular storage type selection. So for instance, you can go into your storage bucket and say, you know what, video A, I want this to remain on standard storage, which falls under the category of protection of that durability, etc. But maybe video B, which is a lower quality version of video A, you can again go in, right click the file, and we'll go through that, and you can see how you can specify that as RRS. So you have very granular control over the objects that are in your S3 bucket that are standard storage protected, and the ones that have RRS that is applied to them. Now, if you're looking for that link that I talked about earlier, where you can go and check the most up-to-date pricing information, because price is one of those things that's constantly changing, especially with storage, you would visit this link that I have on here for you in order to figure out, well, how much would you pay for RRS and how much would you pay for standard storage. All right, all this stuff is really cool, and I'm pretty sure you guys want to get your hands on it. You want to get your hands wet, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to do some demos on S3. We're going to create an Amazon S3 bucket. We're going to manage some S3 objects. I'm going to show you how you can turn your S3 into a static website. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dig in and do some demos around S3 storage. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to access the AWS Management Console. So to do that, we went to aws.amazon.com/console. Now, a word of advice here. I would recommend that you use either Internet Explorer, maybe in compatibility mode, or if you want to avoid some of the issues that I had during testing, I'm using Google Chrome. I don't know why IE was having some issues with some of the commands while executing some of the commands. So anyway, again, if you're trying with IE, try compatibility mode and maybe you can get around that. But if you start experiencing some issues, try Chrome or another browser. First thing we want to do is we obviously want to sign in, and I am going to enter my super secret password, and this would be the time for you to enter your super secret password. Once you come to the summary screen here for AWS Web Services, what we want to do is under Storage and Content Delivery, we want to click on S3. Once that comes up, since we don't have any buckets created yet, what we want to do is click on Create Bucket. Now, we get to this point. Now, it's important here that you realize that the bucket name has to be a unique name. Recall during the presentation, we talked about the fact that S3 is internet accessible, right? Which means users are going to be able to access this. Now, why would this need to be unique? Well, it would need to be unique because it's going to be something to the extent of the bucket name that you choose, .amazon.com. So it can't be something that conflicts with someone else's bucket. Now, it has to be unique within all the buckets that are available in this particular region. Now, from the drop down, you can select any other region where you want to place your bucket. For now, I'm just going to keep it at default, and I'm going to go ahead and select a bucket name. Let's try Wired Brain Coffee. Now, I've used this name before, but I've deleted it, so it should accept it. If it doesn't, that means there's a conflict and we would have to change it. Now, in your case, if you go ahead and put a bucket name and click on Create, and that bucket name comes back with an error, what that means is that bucket name isn't unique. Someone else is probably using it. So what you want to do is make that unique name so that it becomes internet accessible. So if I click on Create here, it accepted it. Again, I've deleted this. I've used this bucket name before and I've deleted it, but it still accepted the fact that it's still unique and nobody apparently has used it. Now, the first thing that you'll see is you're presented with a summary screen. This is all of the details about this particular bucket, and you have options of configuring it in different types. So we're going to skip this for a second here. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now, the first thing that we want to do is click on the bucket. You'll find that, well, your bucket is empty. Well, if the bucket is empty, the first thing that you want to do is add content to it. Now, you can obviously create folders. I'm sure you figured that out. What I want to do for now is click on Upload. And once I do that, what I want to do is click on Add Files. And from there, let's go ahead and click on Downloads. Now, I have several files that I have here. Now, you can select one file and upload it at a time. For example, we can do this and click on Open, or we can also do Add Files, for example, and select the whole batch, and then go ahead and click on Open as well. And once you're ready, you obviously click on the start upload, and it's going to start uploading all of this content to your bucket. And you'll notice that it's pretty fast. I mean, it gets this stuff up there pretty quickly. And I'm uploading random stuff, right? So I uploaded the WinRAR executable, I uploaded a bunch of files in the form of images, etc. Now, if you find yourself uploading a number of files, and again, you want to organize things, it's very easy. You can come up here and click on Create Folder. In my case, because I have a bunch of files, what I'm going to do is I'm going to name it Images within my bucket here. And you can either move files into it, or you can even copy files. So you can do right click and you'll have a bunch of options that you can choose from. Or if you select the file and click on Actions up here, you're also going to be presented with the same type of drop-down menu. So if I click on Copy and then right click in here and just basically do Paste into, you'll find that it will paste that particular file within the directory. Now, there's one thing to note before we move any further, that S3 has a flat file structure. So the file system isn't a complicated file system. So whereas we just created a file within images, the way it records it is images / that file name. And all of these are, the file name is, again, it's put into a flat file, essentially, very similar to the way databases do it. And the reason they do that is for the speed of search, so that they can get to things, so that they can index things quicker. If you have folders and directories, then you would have to go through all these folders and directories, and that would slow that indexing and that searching process. So as a result, it's a very, very flat file where they place everything. So again, in this case, it would be images / that file name. So it organizes it for you from a UI perspective, from the user interface, the user experience perspective. You're getting the feel of a folder, but realistically in the background, that's not really a folder, it's just how it's organizing them. Now, if I go ahead and click on images here, what you'll find is, voila, that file is in there. Now, if we go back, recall I told you earlier that one of the reasons why you can use S3 is to present this information to the internet. You can make it accessible from the internet. But at this point, these particular files are not internet accessible. And to prove it, for example, you can click on a particular file here, and you can navigate either the properties of the file. For example, if you go into properties here, it will give you the properties of this particular file, or you can always, again, right click on it and drag down to properties. But for the purposes of this demo, you'll find that there's a link here to this particular file. So if I go ahead and click on this link, it's broken, right? There's nothing here. It's not allowing access. Now, in order for you to allow access to this particular file, well, what we want to do is grant permissions first. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and expand permissions. And right now, I'm the only one that has access to this file. I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Permissions. And from the drop down, you have several options. If you click on everyone, that means everyone in the world is going to get access to this particular file. If you do authenticated users, I mean, that's self-explanatory. Any user that's logged in will be able to do that. If you use log delivery, that's a user that's essentially a service account that Amazon uses in order to deliver notifications to you against particular files. So you can use that. Me is just an alias for adding yourself in a kind of a shortcut or a quick way. So because I want this to be internet accessible, I'm going to go ahead and select everyone. And then I need to give it some attributes, right? I need to be able to give it, well, what kind of permissions do you want to use? Now, depending on the type of file and how granular and how particular you want to be, you can select, for the most part, open, download, and view. Now, this is an image, so they would have to download this particular image and then open it in order to view it. If this was maybe a text file, then maybe view would be enough because they don't necessarily have to download the file and view it. So again, I find that if you're giving everyone permission, it's pretty safe to do open, download, and view. That's pretty standard in order for you to give users access to it. Now, if I scroll a little bit down, if I click on save, look what happens if I click on the link now. Voila, right? So just imagine again in my brother's example, if I needed to do this for his Amazon listings, how easy that would be. Now you're probably asking, well, Eli, do I have to do this for all of these files individually like this? Well, the answer is you could if you want to, or you can come in here and essentially select files, multiple files. So let's say you're selecting this file, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key and up, and I've selected a bunch of files here. What you can do is you can right click and you can do these make public. So if you click on the make public shortcut here, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. It'll go through and it will make all of them public. Now look what happens if you look at the permissions. that were configured essentially against this particular file, it essentially did the same thing, right? So it did open view. It did not grant, for example, the view right here, but it did make it open download. So let's see what happens if I click on the link. Bada bing, bada boom, look at that. So now these images are accessible again from the internet. Now, recall during the presentation, we talked a little bit about the fact that you can place certain images, certain files, certain things that you have in your bucket. You can either put them on standard storage or you can put them on reduced redundancy, right? And I told you I'd show you where you can do that. So let's say you wanted to put certain files in the images folder here. And oops, let's go back and let's make sure this is selected, and then we can click on properties. So if you wanted to do that, what you would do is from the properties menu, if you expand details, and again, you can access properties simply by right clicking and go into properties, but I find that this is just quicker. You'll find that under details, you'll find it right here. So you can either do standard, or maybe if this is the images where you're going to place all of your thumbnails and you really don't want it to be, the standard one because it's more expensive and etc., you can put it in redundancy reduced, and then you can simply click on apply. Now you can also have you have the ability also of doing encryption. So if this was maybe an important folder, you can apply encryption against it in the form of AES 256 or AS 256, or you can select none if you don't want to get into data encryption. When you're ready, you can click on save. Now recall I told you can get very granular with this particular setting, right? So if you wanted to do it on a per file basis, you can select that particular file, go to properties again. And again, from the details drop down here, maybe this particular file needs to be standard and maybe you want to apply encryption against this particular file. So you can get very, very granular in how you divvy up or how you divide or where you place the different files and folders within your bucket. Now recall I also told you that you can use S3 as a web hosting, a static web host essentially. Now to do that, if you go back up to the main bucket here, if you click on it, and then click on properties, you're going to have a display of all the options that you can perform against your particular bucket. We talked about permissions, but let's talk about static web hosting. So from static web hosting perspective, you have several options. What's selected by default right now is do not enable web hosting. You can, and I'm going to talk about enable it in a second, but you can also redirect it. So if you were trying to redirect it to another bucket or to another domain name, you have the option in here of coming in and doing that. For our purposes, what you want to do here is you want to select an index page, right? An index document. This could be index.htm, index.html, default.htm, or default.asp, depending on the type of content that you have. The default page, it's that initial page that people will hit on your website. So you would have to specify that. Now, because I don't have an index page per se, what we're going to do here is we're simply going to select one of the files that's available already in my bucket and make that act as if it was that particular index file. Now you can also put a description in here. For example, I don't know, let's just do error. Actually, let's do the other one. Let's do, just to ensure that we're not going to get an error here, let's do, since it's the error one, let's do kids-cio .jpg. And let's go ahead and click on save. And now watch what happens when I click on this particular endpoint. See, it automatically defaulted to this particular file that we selected to be our index file. So if this was, for instance, an index.htm or HTML, then it would display that, and you'd be able to navigate your website from this particular location. All right, let's go ahead and close out of here. Now, other things that you can do here. So again, if I come up here and show you some of the properties of this particular bucket. If we go ahead and collapse that, you're probably looking at this and you're, if you're like me, something is clicking in your mind. You're saying, you know what, this looks awfully like a Dropbox. Well, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at versioning and you can enable versioning, which means you'll be able to save several, every time you make a change to a particular file, it's going to save that version so you can revert back to it. This gives you an idea of, well, all of the functionality for Dropbox is really built in. All that Dropbox really did is they created a Windows client, a Mac client, an iOS client, and leverage all of the hooks in the back end of S3 and made it look pretty so that we're able to consume it in a kind of an easy, seamless way. But all the features are there. Now, they're able to do that because, again, accessing S3, and Dropbox is not the only one. There are other software that can access S3. They're able to access these functionality, these features through the REST API that S3 provides. So all they're doing is their particular software is then issuing commands against this platform, and they're able to do some really neat things. So again, the UI here that I'm showing you that S3 presents allows you to do certain things. But for example, from a permissions perspective, if you're using the REST API, you'll be able to get a lot more granular within the permissions. You'll be able to grant and deny a lot more permissions than what you have here by default. So again, it gives you an idea for what you can do with S3. Now, some of the features here are a little outside of the scope of this particular lesson in this course, but again, some of them are also pretty self-explanatory, like events, for instance. You can configure events up here. You can configure versioning, life cycle tags, etc., etc. So this gives you an idea of what you can do from an S3 perspective. Don't tell me you're not having fun. This was a really cool module. We covered a lot of stuff, and it's really cool to see the power of AWS at your disposal, the ease by which you can create services, the capabilities, the creativity that you can use to leverage AWS and for your organization and for your customers. So let's bring this around and let's recap what we've learned. We started off by talking about ephemeral storage. We talked about the fact that ephemeral means temporary. Ephemeral in this case means temporary block level storage, which means it is attached to the EC2 instance and the storage is coming from the same server host that is provisioning that EC2 instance. You're getting access to that local storage on that particular server. We talked about the fact there are no SLAs, there are no guarantees as far as performance. One of the reasons for no guarantees is, again, this is free storage, so you don't pay for ephemeral storage. But because it's also free and there are no guarantees, you might have a noisy neighbor, you might have several users on that particular storage hammering that local storage. As a result, you might see a performance degradation. But it's very useful for things like web server farms where the data is being replicated and you don't really care. Talked about the fact that the data will persist on reboots. It won't, however, if you terminate or if you stop that particular instance. From ephemeral storage, we moved on to understanding AWS S3. We talked about the fact that it's the first service that was launched by AWS. We talked about the fact that you have two services there. You have standard and you have RRS. And with RRS, you have the reduced reliability, but you have the same performance and latency performance metrics that you would get with an S3. We talked about the pricing. We talked about SLAs. And then we went into a demo of how to create an Amazon S3 bucket, how to upload files into S3 bucket, how to create folders in an S3 bucket, how to expose these files and these folders to the internet so people can access them, how to turn your S3 bucket into a website. We talked about all of the features that you can use from an S3 bucket's perspective. Finally, I hope this module was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.